how do you go about managing?
Alrighty guys, so welcome everybody to today's webinar. So hopefully you guys can all hear me loud and clear. Comment down below if you guys can all hear me. And let's get started. So let me just ensure that everything is working fine. I think there might be a couple of things. Okay, yeah, so unfortunately live chat is not allowed for some reason. I'm not sure why that is, but anyway, let's jump right in, and hopefully you guys will be all good. Okay, cool. Let's begin. So today's webinar, just so that everybody understands, is going to be on scholarships. Okay. A lot of parents have asked me in recent days about, the scholarship exams, what it entail. And so today what I want to do is jump on the iPad real quick and basically explain to everybody all the intricacies, all the nuances around scholarships. Because I know a lot of you guys have questions, like which schools should we apply for? What should we do? What are the different types of strategies? What is the different types of, tests that you need to prepare for in scholarship? And what's the best way of preparing for them. Okay, so I'll be explaining and answering basically all of those questions today. And also, I think I've just enabled live chat just then, so if you do have any questions, you can definitely let me know, and I'm more than happy to answer whatever questions you guys might have. Okay, so hopefully you guys are watching this live, or if you do end up watching a recording of this, hopefully you guys find it useful. Okay, cool. So I think the first question that parents ask me is, which scholarships should we apply for? What should be the general scholarship strategy? So let's just write that down. Scholarship strategy. The simplest way to put it is you should be applying to scholarships everywhere, okay? Not just for the schools that you want to get scholarships to. You should basically apply to as many different scholarships as possible. The best reasoning, or the only reasoning behind this, is you want to basically maximize probability and you want to maximize chance. Okay, so that's one reason, probability and chance. And the other thing is, a huge part of the scholarship test is obviously getting used to the AAS exam, and obviously the more times you do that, the more familiar you will be and the higher mark you'll score. The other thing is interview, right? So a lot of people don't realize this, but the interview basically weeds out 50% of applicants. So even if you get a really, really good score, if you don't perform very well at the interview, if you're not prepared or you're not ready for the interview, again, all of that study kind of went to waste then, in a way, because if you don't pass the interview, then obviously you can't get a scholarship, which is unfortunate because a lot of really, really smart kids unfortunately can't pass the interview, and so they don't get a scholarship basically. So it's very, very important for these two reasons. So I would go and apply it to as many scholarships as possible. So if you can apply to, like, let's say 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, that'll be great. Okay, so the more you do, basically, the better. Even for parents who don't really want a scholarship, it's also a good idea to go for a scholarship test, just because in the lead up towards selective, it's also good practice. Okay, so even for those who are only applying for selective, it's always good practice to do the scholarship test. Just because you'll have a pretty good test to practice on, okay? I know scholarship tests and selective schools tests are very, very different, but it's a great opportunity to, again, see where your child, stands. Obviously, they spend a lot of time and money on building the scholarship tests, especially AS and ASA, and so those tests are going to be a lot more accurate at gauging your child's ability than the typical trial tests or mock exams that you'd find at any coaching college, including Scholarly's, okay? Because the amount of time, they will spend a whole year just developing, one test for a school, right? And so the amount of time and energy spent into that is obviously far, far greater than what most tutoring colleges are capable of doing. So just keep that in mind. It's also good practice for that. Okay, so awesome, awesome. So hopefully that's clear. Another question that a lot of parents ask is, Stephen, where can I find the list of schools for scholarship, and which schools should I be applying for? Like I've mentioned, you can find a list online. If you just type in AAS scholarship and you type in, what's the other one? ASA scholarship, you'll be able to find a list of schools. I'll probably publish a list of schools pretty soon anyway. Just to let you know, it's not too late to apply to a lot of these schools. So a lot of the applications haven't closed yet, especially for schools that have scholarship tests in like February and March. A lot of them haven't closed yet, so you can still apply, right? So you still have a long time to apply, so make sure that you put in your application soon, right? So applications still open for a lot of schools, right? Applications are still open, because I know a lot of parents were like, Stephen, have applications completely closed? And no, they haven't, right? It's still open for a lot of people, so you can still apply to a lot of these schools. Okay, cool. Now, the next point that I wanted to cover is the difference between AAS, ASA, and the Selective Schools test. So what is the difference between the scholarship test? So let's talk about scholarship test versus selective test. Okay, so this is a big question that a lot of parents have as well. So I'd say the biggest difference between the scholarship test and the selective test would be in thinking skills. So in selective, we have something called thinking skills. In the scholarship tests for AAS, which is the most common scholarship test, this is basically used for, I'd say, more than 80% of the schools, for 80% of the private schools. They test you on abstract reasoning and verbal reasoning. Okay, so abstract reasoning and verbal reasoning, both of which aren't tested in thinking skills, right? Thinking skills, there is very little correlation between abstract reasoning, verbal reasoning, and thinking skills, okay? They're basically completely different. They test very, very different skills. Abstract reasoning of the AAS scholarship test is mainly involves diagrams, okay? So diagrams, pictures, odd one out, patterns, visual patterns, that kind of stuff. You rarely ever see that in thinking skills. Okay, I think the only time where you see that in thinking skills would be in spatial reasoning. Okay, but again, spatial reasoning is quite different to abstract reasoning, as you can see from the title. Abstract means not real. Okay, whereas spatial is related to real spaces. Okay, the other thing that we have is verbal reasoning. So verbal reasoning is essentially vocabulary. So you have a lot of vocabulary in the scholarship test, whereas in thinking skills, we don't have, like, vocabulary is not really tested, right? It might be tested a little bit in, strengthen and weaken questions, but apart from that, it's not really tested. And what I mean by vocabulary would be synonyms, antonyms, right? Antonyms, odd one out. And so it's really just testing your vocabulary skills, okay? So that's the biggest difference between scholarship versus selective. A lot of you guys already know that, so if you already do, that's great. Now, a lot of you guys will be curious to want to know, what are the differences between the two tests in English, so in terms of reading comprehension. So in terms of reading comprehension, I would say that AAS is a lot more traditional. So AAS scholarship is a lot more traditional as opposed to the selective schools test, where you have very new or very distinctive text types. So for example, in selective, you have the paired extracts, right, that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. You have paired extracts, you have the evaluation text, you have closed passage, well, at least in the 2021 selective there was closed passage, in 2022 there wasn't closed passage, but then you also have like summary text or summary sentences. So all of these things, all of these new text types are tested in selective, whereas in AAS it's a lot more traditional. So what you can do, guys, is when you register for an AAS exam, you can actually sign up for their their own online kind of trial tests or their own online tests, and you can have a look at them, okay? That'll give you a good gauge of what their reading comprehension is like, but their reading comprehension is definitely a lot more traditional. So you traditionally just have fiction, non-fiction, and poetry. What we've seen in AAS is, depending on the school, different schools have different exams, okay? So some schools prefer, over the past few years, to put a lot more non-fiction in. That's what I've noticed. So non-fiction seems to be on the rise, and fiction seems to be on like going down a little bit in terms of the amount of extracts, right? So I've had kids report to me that there's a lot of non-fiction in AS, but again, it depends on which AS test you're doing, okay? But we can argue that it's definitely a lot more traditional as opposed to selective. The last big difference between AS and selective would be in the number of questions, okay? So the number of questions and the amount of time given for the test, right? So again, based on what kids have told me and based on what I've seen in terms of questions that they've recited, basically what I've seen is that a lot of the time, based on whatever test, you'll be given less than 1 minute per question in AS. Okay, so sometimes you'll be given 40 seconds per question, sometimes you'll be given 45 seconds per question, but it's generally always less than 1 minute per question in AS, which is very important because it means that the level of difficulty of question in AS is generally easier than selective, I'd say, but you have to complete more quantity, right? So a greater volume of questions in a shorter amount of time. Okay, so typically they give you like 45 minutes and they might ask you to finish 60 questions, right? So you just have to be aware of that. That's something that has been very prevalent in AS over the last few years, as opposed to in the selective schools test. If you look at all the timings, you generally have more than 1 minute. Yeah, basically 1 minute or more than 1 minute. So you have to do 30 questions in 35 minutes, or 30 questions in, 40 questions in 40 minutes. So you generally have a lot more time, okay? So you definitely have a lot more time in selective as opposed to scholarship. So hopefully that's clear, okay? Hopefully that is making sense to everyone, okay? Awesome. Okay, so actually, there are some questions. So Matt's asked, so thinking skills is more akin to cognitive learning, cognitive applied learning hybrid of English, maths, any link with science. Okay, so Matt, it might be a good idea for you to watch. Actually, you can go online. So Matt, if you don't know about the selective schools test, you can just go online, type in 2022 selective schools test, and you can have a look for yourself. I would say thinking skills is a combination of critical reasoning, which is like argument analysis, argument flaws, stuff like that. There is a lot of applied maths. I would say the applied English is more logical in nature, so it's not really literature. It's more like logical language, conditionals, if, maybe, must, like that kind of stuff. Okay, cool. So hopefully that makes sense. But you can definitely go on the 2022 Selective Schools test and download the PDF and look at that yourself. Or you can actually go onto our YouTube channel and watch the explanations. Okay, but it's all there. Okay, cool. Yeah, so yeah, it's definitely a lot more applied, I'd say, as opposed to the scholarship test, which is more abstract in nature. Okay, cool. Excellent. Excellent. Awesome. Okay, let's move on. So I think another question that parents had. Yeah, okay, so, in terms of differences. Another big difference between selective and scholarship would be in the writing. So, writing for AAS is generally narrative or persuasive, which is, again, very traditional. Whereas, for the selective schools test, it's a lot more open-ended. So I would say it's non-fiction, open-ended, right? And so it could be really any text type. In 2021, from memory, it was a newspaper report. In 2022, it was a diary entry. And so, really, we see that these topics are pretty weird and wacky. These text types are also, they could really be anything. So just be aware of that. So writing in AS is narrative persuasive. It's a lot more formulaic, a lot more traditional than the selective, which you can be tested on anything. So in terms of difficulty, right, I would say the selective schools test is actually more difficult, right? So selective is more difficult as opposed to scholarship in terms of the actual questions, but the scholarship test is more selective, right? So very few people are given scholarships, right? So scholarship is more selective than selective, if that makes sense. So typically, depending on the school, you might have anywhere from 200 to 400 people sitting the scholarship test, just so that parents understand. So you have anywhere from 200 to 400 people sitting a scholarship test. You might even have more at certain schools, but generally about 200 to 400 people will sit the scholarship test per year group. So like, let's say, the U6 has gone to the U7, there's 200 to 400 of them. And then out of that 200 to 400, they'll probably give interviews to double the amount of scholarships they're going to give out that year. So for most schools, they give out anywhere between 5 to 20 scholarships. I know that's a pretty big range, but yeah, they'll give out anywhere from 5 to 20 scholarships. Generally, full scholarships will be a very finite number of them, and there'll be quite a number of partials. So for example, King's gives a whole bunch of partial scholarships. Sydney Grammar also gives a lot of partial scholarships. And so, 5 to 20 scholarships, and they'll basically give double that in terms of the amount of interviews, right? So typically they might award anywhere from 10 to 40 interviews. And so it's really, really difficult to even get an interview to most private schools. And obviously you have to pass the interview, you have to do very well at the interview to get a scholarship. Okay? So hopefully that's clear. Hopefully some numbers, some basic numbers. Don't quote me on these numbers. These numbers are very, very, just based on observation, based on what parents have told me, things of that nature. Okay. So, and again, it really depends on what school. Okay. So some schools only offer like 2 scholarships. Other schools offer like 20. Some schools offer 10. Generally, the bigger the school, the more scholarships they offer. Okay. So hopefully that's clear. Okay, awesome. Cool. Excellent. So hopefully that's clear. And so yeah, scholarships are definitely more difficult to get as opposed to getting in selective. And if you were to compare the level of difficulty, it would be difficult to compare to, what selective school, but just know that scholarships are generally more difficult than selective. Okay, cool. Let's move on. Okay, so I think another big question is based on this, Stephen, how would you go about organizing the workload? Okay, so what kind of workload? How would you go about balancing the workload between scholarship training and selective training? Well, like I've already mentioned, the 2 exams are quite different. So the selective schools test is very, very different to the scholarship test. And so it's often really difficult to balance, honestly. So this is a strategy that I recommend to most parents, which is don't put too much attention, don't put too much focus on scholarship training until you're pretty certain that your child is going to be able to get into a top 10 selective. Okay? So in other words, ensure that your child can get into a top 10 selective first. That's the most important thing. But once they're already at that top 10 selective, or if they got into a top 10 OC, and they're already in a top 10 OC, then you have a pretty good shot at, doing more scholarship training. Okay? Right? So everybody note that down. So like I said, only once you've guaranteed a spot in a top 10 selective, you're already doing very, very well. So what does top 10 selective look like? Well, depending on what trial test, in the scholarly trial tests, if you're scoring between, I'd say 70% plus across the board in all your trial tests, then you have a pretty good shot at getting a scholarship. Okay, but that's at scholarly, right? I don't know about different other coaching colleges. I can't speak on them, but in our trial tests, if you're getting above 70%, right now you have a really, really good shot at getting into a top 10 selective, which means you can afford to spend some time on scholarship training. Or if you already got into a top 10 OC, then you can immediately begin scholarship training, okay? But even if you don't begin scholarship training, you should still go for the scholarships anyway, scholarship tests, just for, the reference experience for your kids, okay? So just a couple of different variables to consider. Okay, so how is scholarship training different to selective? What is the differences in, in learning between scholarship versus selective? And like I mentioned, there are a whole bunch of differences, right? So there's differences in writing, there's differences in abstract reasoning, there's obviously a lot of differences in English. The only thing that's not too different would be maths. And so all of these things like abstract reasoning, verbal reasoning, English, your child has to be trained. Okay, so your child has to learn how to do all of these questions. They have to be very, very familiar with all of these questions. They have to be familiar with the narrative and persuasive writing types, which aren't really tested in the selective course or the Selective Schools test. So you do have to spend a lot of time on these three things, or else you won't have a really good chance at getting a scholarship. So how long do you need to spend? Again, it really just depends on how you're, what you're doing in terms of homework and stuff like that. But what I would recommend is you should probably give yourself at least 6 months to a year of scholarship-specific training. And you're not going to get that doing a Selective Schools course, okay? Like, simply put, just because these things aren't tested in the selective program, okay? They're not taught in the selective program. So you got to learn scholarship writing, you got to learn scholarship abstract reasoning and verbal reasoning, and you have to get used to the speed of the test as well, which is huge, because the speed of the scholarship test is very, very different to the speed of the Selective Schools test. So again, just things to think about. Cool. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. Adam Zhao asks, is it harder to get a scholarship for students who are already in a private school? Yeah, of course. That was going to be one of the points that I'd mentioned today, which is obviously if you're already going to a private school and you're trying to get a scholarship at that private school, it's very difficult. It's difficult for a couple of different reasons. Number one, you're already a full-paying student, so they have very little incentive to give you a scholarship. I do know that most schools have, things like a scholarship for the ducks. Okay, so if you top the school in terms of just internal assessments, and you become the ducks of year 6, you might be given a scholarship, like a partial scholarship. Okay. But generally, they know that you're going to pay anyway, so they're not too interested in giving you guys a scholarship. They're more interested in gathering talent from elsewhere. But it really just depends on a case-to-case basis. I've seen some schools offer, their own students full scholarships just based on how great the student is. Okay? So if you're really, really good and they're scared of losing you, then they will give you a scholarship. The other thing is, if you get a scholarship to another school, generally speaking, that would be evidence that you're good enough and your school will give you a scholarship. So in other words, you should be applying to as many scholarships as you can, right? That's just the easy way out, just for extra practice, and more so for that peace of mind in the case that your school doesn't offer you a scholarship and you're actually deserving of one. Okay, but yeah, it's definitely more difficult. Okay, it's definitely more difficult. Okay, does Scully train for selective or scholarship? Yeah, we do for both. So if you want to send a message in on scullytraining.com, we can definitely help you out. But yeah, we'll talk about that at the end. We'll talk about that at the end. Okay, yeah, so to answer your question, it's definitely more difficult if you're applying from your own school. The way to solve that problem would be to apply to scholarships from other schools, and then also make sure that you're actually good enough, because if you are coming second at your school and you're wanting a full scholarship, that's very unlikely because you're not doing that well. They already have a lot of data on you, so it's unlikely that they're going to give you a full scholarship. So just be aware of that. That's just something to consider. Okay, cool. So let's go to the next bit. Okay, so a lot of parents are asking, Steve, how do I prepare for the scholarship exam, especially in writing? So you have two things, like I mentioned, narrative and persuasive. The biggest problem that I've seen in terms of the scholarship test is, in order to get an interview, you have to be in the top 4% of basically everything. Generally speaking, if you're at a competitive school, you'll get a report. Generally, most schools will get a report. Some schools don't. But from what I've seen, the kids who get interviews are typically kids who get top 4% of every subject. Okay, so maths, English, writing, everything. They have to be in the top 4% of basically every single subject. And only when you're in the top 4% do you have a chance of getting an interview. Okay, if you're out of the top 4%, it used to be a couple of years ago that if you had like 2 or 3 top 4% and you had 1 or 2 like top 11% or top 10%, you'd still be able to get a scholarship interview. But what I've noticed over the last few years is, generally speaking, you have to be in the top 4% of everything in order to get a scholarship interview. So just be aware of that. For most kids, writing is generally their biggest weakness, and so a lot of kids miss out on scholarship interviews because they're not good enough at writing. Okay, that's what I've noticed. That's when I started Scholarly. That was the biggest problem. Generally, kids were all right in English. You can learn abstract reasoning at home. You can do all of that kind of stuff. But when it comes to writing, that's where kids don't really know what they're doing. Okay, so it's very important that you practice in narrative and persuasive writing. We have a whole bunch of videos on our YouTube channel that can help you with that. But yeah, writing, narrative, persuasive is extremely important. You have to be in the top 4%. So that's how important, writing is, right? It's not really an aggregate score. Like, obviously, different schools have different ways of calculating their figuring out if they want to award you a scholarship or not. But from what I've noticed, you have to be a good all-rounder. You can't just be, top 4% of this and then, top 10% somewhere else. You have to be all-round top 4% across every single subject. And there is generally a huge emphasis on writing. Obviously, schools don't talk about, what they use to judge scholarship interview candidates. But again, from what I've seen, writing is definitely something that they look at. Okay, anything you would recommend for a family with a kid in year 1 to help prepare for scholarships or selective tests? Yeah, I would just say read a lot of books. I'd say that's the most important thing. When you're in year 1, I don't think you need coaching. I would say if you're in year 1, there's a couple of things you can do. I'd say number 1, read. So Road, Dahl would be a great place to start in terms of reading. Number 2 is memorize a lot of vocab. So go on vocabulary.com and start playing games there. That's really important. And then in terms of maths, I would recommend you can either do workbooks at home or you can go on iExcel and you can do maths. You can do a lot of maths games there, right? So you don't need anything too specific when you're in year 1. I would say main thing is just read a lot and build your vocab, and also go on iExcel to work on maths. And that's all you really need from up until like year 3, honestly. Okay, so if you do that all the way until year 3, you'll be fine. And then year 3, once you're in year 3, then you can come find me at Scholarly, and then we can help you get a scholarship because you'll be like well prepared and stuff. Okay, but yeah, I wouldn't waste any time or money on coaching that young of an age, because the amount of time that a child would need is not something that a tutor would be able to provide, and so it's a lot easier for you to do it as a parent, unless you want to get a tutor to teach a kid for like 2 hours a day, which is highly unlikely. So don't do that. Okay. Cool. We'll move on to the next one. The next big thing about scholarship tests is interview. So a lot of people don't really talk about interview at all, but interview is huge. Interview is really hard as well, because the main problem with interviews is most kids at a young age, when they're in year 5 or year 4, they haven't really had much interview experience, right? They haven't gone to a job interview, they haven't done any kind of interview in the past. And so what typically happens is most kids are not ready. They don't know how to express themselves. So a simple question that I ask, and most interviewers will ask, would be, tell me a little bit about yourself. And most kids would say something along the lines of, my name is X, I'm like 11 years old, and I go to this school, okay? And then because they haven't really prepared a response, or because they haven't really thought very clearly about their own strengths, what they enjoy, their passions, and they can't articulate that, what often happens is the interviewers won't be able to see the full character of the child during the interview. And because of that, a lot of kids miss out on scholarships. And so interview is very, very important. I'm not going to say you need training for the interview, but you definitely need to be a noteworthy or a good person in general. So you definitely need to have the right character for a private school, which is just a good character. And what I mean by that is just having virtues of leadership, being generous, being good, being kind. All of those things are pretty important. Unfortunately, a lot of parents, don't tell their kids that, it's important to show that during the interview. And what typically happens in the past, this is what I've seen, is a lot of kids end up just showing off a whole bunch of their achievements, which is really not the purpose of the interview. The interview is really just because they already know that you're smart, that you've already been selected based on your scholarship test results. They just want to know that, number one, you're a kind, decent human being who can express themselves. And unfortunately, a lot of kids and parents go in and they just talk about all of their achievements. So don't talk about your achievements too much during the interview if you are going for a scholarship interview, just because they're more interested in who you are, not what you've done. Okay. And so they'll ask things like, where do you see yourself in 5-6 years? What do you want to do in the future? What do you do on the weekend? And so all of these questions really trying to figure out the character of kids. And that is not something that you can train within, that's just not something that you can train, okay? Within a few sessions or here. They're really gonna look over, your entire life. And the other thing is, a lot of these interviewers have a lot of experience, many, many years of experience as well. So the thing that I tell parents is, it's very important that your child participates in a whole bunch of different activities, very well read, has a very well thought out plan for their future, right, in terms of what they want to do. Because if they don't, then when you go to the interview, there's nothing I can do in terms of interview preparation to prepare them for the interview, if that makes sense, right? Obviously, we can craft and we can do things to describe, their activities and what they've done in the past a little bit better. But in general, they need to have, completed those tasks or done those activities already, right, in order for us to, actually bring it into the interview. So it's very, very important, if you're a parent watching this right now, to build your child's character. And the other thing that I want to mention is public speaking is crucial, okay? Public speaking is absolutely crucial. From what I've seen, there's a direct correlation between kids who do who have public speaking training and those who pass the interview. And so many parents don't realize that when you're going for a scholarship, it's not just you got to do well on the scholarship tests, but in actual fact, they will eliminate 50% of candidates just through the interview, right? So 50% of people are just gone, right, immediately after the interview, which is, just unfortunate, because some kids work really, really hard, they study really, really hard for the tests, and then come the interview, they're just eliminated. So it's very important. Okay. So I have a lot of questions right now. What would be smart to say? Does sport achievement a consideration of scholarship, like in the interview? Okay, so I think there are a lot of interesting questions, which is great. Okay, so I think the best way to explain this, right, is you can have two kids who have the same achievements who go to the interview, and yet one will get the scholarship and the other kid won't get the scholarship. Okay, so I've had kids go in, say, hey, you know what, I've got my Amos in piano, I'm on the state basketball team, I love this, I love that, and they still don't get the scholarship. And it's not because of their achievements, because they already know that you've achieved a lot, but it's because of character. So this is what I'd say, right? Like, the answer is not, hey, Stephen, what do I say? You know, how do you respond to the interviewer, you know, when they ask this, or how do you respond there? It's, if you have the right character, you'll know exactly what to say. And so that's really the responsibility of the parent, to ensure that a child has a great character, right? And I'm talking about things as simple as kindness. Okay, when examiners or when the interviewers ask, what would you like to do in the future? There will be some kids who say, hey, I want to become a doctor. And then the interviewers will ask, why do you want to be a doctor? And the kids are confused. They don't know why they want to do it. It's just been said to them before. And so they don't know. You know what I mean? And interviewers can see through that kind of stuff very, very quickly. Likewise, you might say, hey, I play piano, or I play, you know, 3 musical instruments. The interviewer might ask, okay, why do you play these 3 musical instruments? And again, the kid might not have an answer for it. And so these are just, so the reasons why you participate in things, the reasons why you do things are more important than what you actually do. I've seen kids who go in who have no co-curricular achievements whatsoever. They don't participate in anything, and yet they get the scholarship because they just have a great heart. They're very kind, and they demonstrate leadership qualities. Okay, so for a lot of parents, like, achievements are obviously important, but it's also character is crucial as well. I would say public speaking is more important than debating in this case, because I would say that debating focuses more on you know, arguments and finding great arguments, whereas public speaking in drama focuses more on expressing yourself, right? So for example, I would be a terrible debater because I wouldn't be able to debate on, like, you know, if you gave me a topic that I didn't know, you know, what to talk about, I wouldn't be able to speak on it. You know what I mean? So I would say public speaking and drama would be most beneficial for the interview, okay, as opposed to debating. That's just my personal opinion. That's what I've seen. And we run debating courses. So, I mean, like, you know, it's just my honest opinion. Yeah, taking part in community service is great. But again, it's important that the kid wants to do it. Okay, it can't be, hey, you know, why'd you do that? Why'd you participate in community service? Oh, my mum made me do it. You know what I mean? Your child has to really want to do these things themselves. You know, the interviewer might ask, hey, you know, who's your, you know, who's your role model? And again, you'll see a lot of kids who are very, very excited. They get very, very excited talking about their role model because it's a true role model. It's a true passion. So for example, I was talking to a child. This kid ended up getting a scholarship to a pretty big private school. I won't name the name, but I was talking to him, and he basically said, Stephen, you know, when I grow up, I want to be a doctor. And then I asked him why. He was like, I don't really know. Like, my parents told me it'd be a great thing to do. Okay. I'm like, don't say that at the interview. I'm like, what do you actually want to do? And then he told me, he's like, well, I actually really, really enjoy robotics. I love robotics. And then he started talking about all of these robotics competitions around the world, and he was so excited about that. And I was like, say that at the interview. You know what I mean? Right? Instead of saying, hey, you want to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, right? You should say that instead. But on the other hand, there was another girl that I was training, and I asked her, hey, well, what do you want to be in the future? And she says, hey, I want to be a pediatrician. I want to be a pediatrician at a children's hospital. I'm like, why do you want to do that? And then she started talking about how, you know, she was watching documentaries about, you know, vulnerable children and women in certain countries, and she really wants to look after the underprivileged children in society. And so I was like, okay, that seems like a very, very noble, very, very good thing to do, right? So it doesn't matter what you say. It really just matters, you know, what's your reasoning behind it. And again, because the interviewers have interviewed a lot of kids, right? It's you know, you have to ingrain these things in your kids, right? And they'll be able to see through just, oh yeah, you know, hey, we just did community service just to look better on the application. So it's very, very important. Okay. Yeah, okay, cool. Excellent. So yeah, community service is great. Like, do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying, you know, you have to have the right reasons behind doing it as well. Okay. As long as you have the right reasons behind doing it, I don't see there to be any problem. Okay. But yeah, achievements are important. I'm not saying achievements aren't important. Achievements are extremely important. Just unfortunately, a lot of, even on the scholarship application and at the scholarship interview, so many parents make the mistake of showing off their kids way too much. And the problem is, when you go to a scholarship interview, they already know that you're smart. Okay? If they already know that you're smart, like, you don't have to show off that you're smarter. You know what I mean? Like, there's no point. They just want to know that you're a good human being. Okay, anyway, so hopefully that's clear. Hopefully you guys understand. And yeah, interview is huge, just because 50% of kids get eliminated immediately. And I mean, honestly, they deserve to get eliminated because, I mean, if you're going to give that sum of money to a child that young, you want to make sure that you're giving the scholarship to the right kid. Okay? Because they really are taking a gamble, a chance with you, because they don't know how you're going to fare over the next 6 years, and they really just have that little interview to gauge, you know, what your character is going to be. Okay, cool. So hopefully that makes sense, right? And yeah, obviously, you know, in our scholarship program, we do a lot of interview preparation and things of that nature, especially when kids actually get the scholarship interview. We do a lot of training before the interviews. Okay, cool, which is why we actually end up getting so many scholarships. Okay, cool. Let's move on. So I think there's I'm just going through the list right now. There's quite a few things we need to cover. Okay, what are the differences between the private schools? So I see a lot of parents ask me, you know, which private schools are better than which? Like, is Sydney Grammar better than Knox? Is Knox better than Newington? Is Newington better than King's? Is, you know, Pymble Ladies versus Askham versus, you know, Ravenswood versus Kambala, right? So a lot of parents are asking a whole bunch of different questions about the different private schools and, you know, what they're good at. So here's what I would suggest. The best thing to do is to book an open day, okay, and to turn up to an open day, because whatever I tell you and whatever you read on the internet, you won't really know until you actually see it for yourself. So that's the first thing that I'd recommend to everyone. So go to an open day at that private school, go inside, talk to the teachers, get a feel for the environment yourself. Now, generally speaking, all private schools are pretty good. Just like all like I'd say the top 10, top 15 selective schools are all pretty good as well. The difference is largely going to be in, number one, culture, right? So some schools have a huge sporting culture. Some schools have a huge culture for arts and theater. Other schools have a huge culture in terms of, like, huge emphasis on language, right? So it really just depends on, you know, what you want for your child. And every single school is very, very different in terms of their in terms of what they offer. So what I definitely recommend there is go on the website and find out specific information in regards to the different schools. Now, one thing that I will say in terms of demand, okay? So I'm going to use the word demand so I don't get into too much trouble, because it's true. So in terms of demand, right, for schools, what I've noticed over the last few years is that the demand for private schools in terms of private scholarships has kind of is almost analogous to the real estate market, okay? And here's what I mean. So, for instance, I'd say 10, 15 years ago, right, a lot of people wanted to go to schools in the inner west, right? So, you know, Trinity was huge, right? Like going to Trinity Grammar, going to Newington was really like everybody wanted to go there back in the day, right? Like 20 years ago. Sydney Grammar was always big. Everybody always wanted to go to Sydney Grammar. But I'd say over the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of the emphasis has shifted, or a lot of the demand has shifted towards the North Shore, right? So a lot of the inner west schools are still very much in demand, but a lot of the crazy demand has gone to the schools in the North Shore. So we're talking Pymble Ladies College, what's it called? Pymble Ladies College, Ravenswood. In terms of boys' schools, Knox, and a lot of the attention has also shifted a little bit towards the east, but it's mainly been the lower North Shore. So I'd say the schools in the lower North Shore are the most competitive. So lower North Shore, upper North Shore, they're the most competitive, especially the girls' schools are the most competitive. Inner West, generally speaking, is less competitive, especially for the girls' schools in the Inner West. I'm not going to name them, but you guys know what they are. They're definitely a lot less competitive compared to the lower North Shore schools. Okay. Now, where is better? I would say it really just, again, depends on your child. Depends on what your child wants to do, whether they want to do music or whether they want to participate in arts, whether they want to, participate in some like languages, or because some schools are better at languages. Like Tutoring Grammar has a great languages department. So it really depends on what you want to do. And then the other thing is you have to consider the kind of hidden benefits. All right. So I want to mention some hidden benefits as well, and we're going to be well taken care of. So hidden benefits include accelerated HSC. So a lot of you guys would know that most private schools offer, a lot of private schools offer the chance to accelerate your HSC. So you can do it in like year 10 or year 11. Or do some subjects in year 10 and year 11. I know for a lot of schools they offer that for maths and computer science and some other subjects as well. And some kids actually accelerate HSC in like year 8, year 9. Okay, and so, some selective schools do that as well. I'm pretty sure North Sydney Boys does that for like IPT and some other schools as well. But it's just more prevalent in private schools. The other thing that I'd mention is IB. So some private schools offer IB, some don't. Parents ask me, which one's better, IB or HSC? I'd say they're both pretty good. IB, there's definitely more emphasis on the humanities, unlike HSC where, you can just kind of specialize in 3 subjects. IB, you have 6 and you have to write an additional essay, okay? For the higher scores, like the higher ATARs, it's definitely easier to score a 45 out of 45 in IB as opposed to a 99.95 in HSC. So just keep that in mind. And then in the end, for a lot of parents who are thinking about medicine, it really still depends on, the interview, right? So whether you do IB or HSC doesn't really matter. The most important thing is still the interview. In medicine, whether it be you're going for the 99.95 medical program at Sydney University, or you're going for like UNSW, undergraduate medicine, it's generally always the interview, right? So a lot of people say, hey, if you get 45 in IB, you can't get in medicine at Sydney Uni, or they don't look favorably towards you. Well, that might be true, but that might be true. Like, for example, I know for a fact that there is a girls' school where there were, I'd say 8 or 9 kids, maybe 10 kids who got 45 in IB, and only one of them, actually none of them got into Sydney Uni Med, right, for the 99.95 program, right? So none of them. They're like 8 or 9. Like basically all of them applied for the Sydney medical program, and I think none or one, so very few got in, right? And again, don't quote me on those numbers. This is just what I've heard. But in terms of the tutors that we hire at Scholarly, because I can speak on behalf of them, there were 2 boys who currently work for me at Scholarly. They got 45 in IB, and they got into Sydney Uni Medical School. And I think there's only 20 to 30 domestic places, and so they got that. And there's a girl, Anastasia, who works for me as well. She went to Santa Sabina, I think, and she got a 45 IB, and she also got into Sydney Uni Medical School, right? So it was fine for them. But again, a lot of it comes down to the interview, not whether you did IB or HSC. So just, again, things to be aware of, okay? So it doesn't really matter what you do. It just, that. Okay, cool. So Amir asks, what is the best private school? Um, what is best private school for girls? Okay. I'm in Adelaide, so any difference for scholarships? Okay. Top 3 boys and girls North Shore based purely on academics. Okay, cool. So, yeah, I'll answer what I think to be the best private schools. So, the best boys private school. Yeah, okay, so I'll break it down simply. So, when we talk about the best private school, you got to think about it from a holistic point of view. You can't just think about it from academics. So, holistically, I would not put Sydney Grammar as my number one. Even though Sydney Grammar is the best academically, it just wouldn't be my number one choice. I would say King's is really, really good. It's very diverse, culturally diverse, and there's a very good emphasis on sports, music, and everything else. At Sydney Grammar, it's the same. It's really, really good. Like there's definitely an emphasis on music, but I'd say for sports, not so much. And then the other thing is, it is very academically selective. So, obviously, if you're academically selective, then you're going to get more students who are, focused on academics rather than other things. Okay. So, yeah. So that's my personal opinion. I think if I had a son, I'd probably send him to either King's or Shaw. Okay. Those would be my top 2. Yeah, those would be my top 2. Cool. And that's assuming that my child doesn't want to do IB. Okay, so if my kid's just happy with doing HSC, I would say King's or Shaw would be my top picks. In terms of girls' schools, this is where it gets a little bit more difficult because there are actually a lot of really good girls' schools. In terms of private schools, and for that matter, North Sydney Girls is actually pretty good as a selective school as well. Yeah, but anyway, in terms of girls' schools, I would say Winona would be my pick for one of the better girls' schools. I'm not sure if it's the best, but if I had a daughter, I'd probably send her to Winona. Yeah, or Winona or Skeggs Darlinghurst. That would be my pick. I typically wouldn't want my child, if I had a child, I wouldn't want my child to go to a school that is too in demand or too big. That's just personal preference. So for a lot of the North Shore schools, they're huge, right? So you have 300, 400 girls in a cohort. So it's huge. They're really, really big cohorts. And from from what I see and from what I hear, I would just prefer for my child to be educated in a smaller cohort. So I would say Winona and Skeggs Darlinghurst would be my pick. But again, like I'm strange, you know what I mean? Like they're just my best schools, you know what I mean? Like, and keep in mind, the factors that I care about, the criteria that I use might be very, very different to you. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay. Let me see. Yeah, so just to answer everyone's questions, Kings, Shaw, Winona, and Skeggs. I think that's it. Oh yeah, and then Kambala would also be pretty high up there for me as well. So Kambala and Askham would be high up there for me as well. Yeah, but I wouldn't wouldn't send them to a North Shore private school. Yeah, just because there's too many people, and I personally don't feel that they would be as well looked after there as opposed to a small school. Yeah, you generally don't want to it's like you generally don't want to buy a stock when it's too hot. So like when everyone's talking about it, that's generally time to leave and go somewhere else. So that's just my personal opinion. So it's better to catch a stock when it's on the rise up. Anyway, let's move on. From your experience, what is the mental health state of kids preparing for the tests? What tips do you have to help them deal with pressure and anxiety? Start earlier. Okay? If you wanted somebody to train for the Olympics and get them Olympic level ready in like a year, it would be very difficult, right? And they would be under a lot of stress. But if you started them off really early, like if you started training them at like, 4 years of age, 3 years of age, 2 years of age, and you gave them 10 years to get into the Olympics, it's very doable, like extremely doable, okay? Like very, very doable. Okay, very, very doable. Okay, yeah, very, very doable. Very, very doable. Yeah, so my advice to parents, especially if they've got young kids, is to start as early as possible. And the reason why you want to do that is just to give them a huge leeway. These tests are hard, and the tests are getting more competitive as we go by. Like I remember teaching the scholarship test 5 years ago, 6 years ago. The standard of kids that we have nowadays is much higher than what it was 10, 15 years ago. Okay, hopefully you guys are clear on that. Yeah. Okay. What's the best selective school? Again, James Ruse is number one, like academically. If you wanted a good boys' school that was more well-rounded, you'd probably look at Sydney Boys. If you wanted a good girls' school that's more rounded, you'd probably look at North Sydney Girls. Right, so North Sydney Girls, Sydney Boys, and James Ruse would be my pick, and Fort Street. Right, so like let's say if my kid just, couldn't get a scholarship, or I just couldn't afford to send them to private school, I think Fort Street would be at the top of my list, just because of the demographic there. I think is more well balanced as opposed to some of the other selective schools. And there's just, it's just everyone's got a different preference, okay? But James Ruse is number one, yeah. How many scholarships do private schools hand out? Yeah, like I mentioned, anywhere from 5 to 20, depending on the school. So okay, cool. I'll talk about the difference between AAS and ASA now, because someone's already asked. So the biggest difference between ASA and AAS is in that ASA is much more difficult than AS in terms of the level of difficulty of the question. Okay, so ASA exams are very difficult. The way to prepare for the ASA exam is, again, you can buy a lot of these sample questions online. Okay, you can buy a lot of the sample questions online, and you'll see that they're pretty hard. The reading comprehension is definitely more fiction-based, as opposed to AAS. So AAS is more non-fiction, whereas ASA is more fiction-based. And if you look at the sample questions in ASA, they're the most difficult. They're like way harder than even the selective schools test, right? Because most of the questions are based on emotion, and there's not just one emotion going. There's like multiple emotions. There's a lot of nuance involved in the test. So the way that I would train for ASA would be actually quite different to the way that I would train for AAS, which is actually what I was going to talk about at the very end. So I know a lot of parents are like, okay, Stephen, what's the solution to all of this? Why are we actually talking about all of this? I will propose a solution at the very end of the video, and a new class that I am running, that will be the first class that I'm actually going to run on Zoom ever. I've never run a class on Zoom before, but I'll be announcing that at the very end of the video, okay? But yeah, to answer your question, preparing for AAS and ASA is a bit different, because ASA, the main difficulty is going to be in the English, right? Especially in the fiction-based emotion. You can get the sample questions, like I mentioned, online. And another place that you can practice for ASA is VCAA. If you type in VCAA GAT, you can get some of the ASA questions there as well, because ASA is the publisher of those questions, and they're actually the closest thing that you can find to the ASA questions. So you can go on VCAA GAT, and you can find some reading comprehension questions that are related to ASA. The only other difference between AS and ASA is there's no abstract reasoning or verbal reasoning in ASA. So it's just, there are two writing pieces though. So in AS, there's only one writing piece, and it can be narrative or persuasive, whereas in ASA, it's narrative and persuasive. So you still need to work on narrative and persuasive. So that's not too different, and you have a pretty difficult math section as well. That integrates a little bit more science as well. So there's more diagrams. There's a lot of graphs to read. So just be aware of that in ASA. Okay. Yeah. Some parents think the kids don't have their talent in academics, so shouldn't push them. Or sometimes they think they don't want to put too much pressure and let kids be kids. Thoughts? Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about it is I think every kid is talented, okay? Now, some kids are more talented than other kids, but every child is talented. And so if you were to ask me, let kids be kids, yeah, I think 100% let kids be kids, but kids also need discipline, okay? I think that's important. So obviously you need fun, you need discipline, you need hard work, and yeah. So, like, my answer to your question is, for any parents who think that their kids are not talented, I'd say think again. Maybe, like, you're not talented enough as a parent to train your child, but that doesn't mean your child is not talented. Every child is talented. And I truly believe that if your child is placed in the right environment and you're good enough as a parent, they're going to do well. So, like, why not ask them to do well? Now, I think the question that parents have is, okay, well, Stephen, how do I know if my child's talented enough for scholarship exams? What kind of ability level, do you think they can get to? That's for you to figure out. Okay, that's for you to spend time with your child to figure out how good they are. And that also depends on your willingness to push them, right? So if you want them to enjoy their life a little bit more, right, and just chill and relax, then that's your prerogative. That's not for me to tell you what to do or what not to do, right? So it depends on what you want for them as well. And so yeah, it really just depends on kind of your risk appetite, your pain appetite. Those are all considerations that you should put in. Yeah. But yeah, 100%. I definitely think you got to find that inner drive to allow them to pursue their dreams, because life is just going to be a lot harder for them, like compared to what life is nowadays for a lot of you guys. So just be aware of that. They should be ready, and so you need to mentally prepare them for the difficult world. Okay. Anyway, I think that's about it. What else was I going to say? Yeah, accelerated HSC programs. I'm not going to list out any particular schools, right? Because every single school has a different school. I think I've already talked about it. Questions asked at interview, I've already mentioned a couple of that. I've talked about the differences in study schedule between selective and scholarship. And yeah, the differences between AS and ASA. So I think I've talked about everything, which is great. Now, for a lot of parents who are wondering, this only applies, by the way, to parents who are currently already in Year 5. If your child is currently in Year 5. So if your child is currently in Year 5, going into Year 6, and you want to have a pretty good shot at getting a scholarship, then you should probably listen to the next 2 minutes. If you're not in Year 5, if you're in Year 4, Year 3, whatever, you're in a much younger year, then you don't need to listen to this. This is not going to be very relevant to you at all. Okay, but if you're in Year 5, it's going to be relevant. Basically, if you're in Year 5 and you're going to Year 6, I'm opening up a new Zoom scholarship class. So this will be taught by me and one other tutor. And the way it's going to run is I'm going to take charge of all the English and writing, as well as the scholarship interview preparation. And then the other tutor is going to take charge of all of the maths and GA components. Okay. Now, the reason why we're running this on Zoom and we're going to keep it as a very, very small class is because I've just noticed, because generally our selective program, for a lot of parents who are watching this who are currently in our scholarship program, we only have an hour every week on scholarship training. And what I found is that that's generally okay for the majority of the term, but in the term leading up to the scholarship exams, there needs to be more work given, right? Because there's so many different nuances, so many different little things to be aware of in the different scholarship tests, and it's just it's impossible to get through all of that in an hour, which is why we have the Zoom scholarship class. Now, keep in mind, this scholarship class, I don't know what the cap on the class is going to be at. I don't know how many places have already gone out, but I think the class is going to be capped at around 30 kids. And from my recollection, I think a lot of it has already been taken up by people. But yeah, I'll definitely be sending an email anyway to everyone in relation to this class. But everything that we talked about in today's kind of webinar will be covered in that class, right? So we'll go through all of these things, and I'll be coaching the kids personally myself over Zoom, so that, you know, I'll be able to spot different weaknesses pretty quickly and be able to coach you guys through that process. Yeah. For parents who are currently in our scholarship program already, if you do want to join this scholarship program, right? So if you've already joined the Term 1 scholarship program and you want to join in this Zoom scholarship, then what you need to do is you should reply to the message that we have, that we will send out, and there will be a certain discount code that you'll be able to use that'll get you the discount. But if you're interested in Zoom scholarship, you're more than welcome to send a message to me personally on Steve Zoo on Facebook, or you can send a message on Workplace, or you can send a message to WeChat or wherever. Okay, but I do think these spots are going to go out pretty quickly because this is the first time that I've done something like this, and I'm doing this really just because I want the kids to do as well as possible. Anyway, that's just only for the U5s. Anyway, that I think is about it. Kids in Year 4, no. You can't join if you're in Year 4, just because this will be a very, very intense course. So no. You're not allowed to join. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to join. Okay, cool. Yeah, hopefully that explains everyone's concerns. Yeah, I know there's a lot of things to think about, but the exams are quite intricate. Like, they're all very, very different, and unfortunately, that's just the case now. Yeah. So my advice to everyone is just start early, right? The earlier you start, the more time you have, the more you work on your fundamentals, the stronger your fundamentals are. When you come into Year 4, Year 5, it won't be as difficult. For a lot of kids who don't work on their fundamentals and they come in Year 4, Year 5, and then they start preparing for selective, it's just a bit too late. So I'd say the earlier you start, the better. Okay, so if you want your kid not to be too stressed out, if you've got a kid in Year 1, that's a perfect time to start just, getting them ready. Okay, getting them ready like kindergarten, Year 1, and getting them ready just by like reading, maths, doing some workbooks at home. There's plenty of great online resources now. So do that so you have all the fundamentals, right? So you're not like learning things like a lot later. Khan Academy is a great resource as well. So there's just plenty of resources that you guys can tap into at a younger age to get their fundamentals all right. And then later on in like Year 3, Year 4, Year 5, it's more you need exam specific training. Okay, that's it. Cool. That is it from me today. And hopefully you guys have learned something. Okay. Okay, will I be doing any in-person classes? Probably not. My son is already doing your selective class. What do you suggest if I want to consider it? Yeah, Summer, we can definitely have a chat. I'll note your name down and we'll have a chat about if we should think about scholarship or not, because it really depends on your level. If you're getting across the board 70% consistently in our selective test, then yeah, you can definitely apply for a scholarship, and you have a pretty good chance at getting a scholarship as well. But if you're not at 70% yet, then you should just be a little bit more careful. Okay, so hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any more questions. You can send me any questions you guys want on Facebook or our Workplace or anywhere, and I'm more than happy to answer if you guys want.